How often have you felt restricted to spiritual practices that seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels is for people like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It is for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants. I am Christine Syme. In this second episode of The Liturgical Rebel, I am in conversation with Drew Jackson about poetry as spiritual practice and how it can help us express the laments and joys of life while enabling us to sit longer in the questions life raises, not looking for answers, but sitting in the mystery of all things. We will also discuss Drew's amazing sensitivity to women in the Gospels and how poetry enables us to access our anger and see it as an invitation to uncover the mystery of life and let go of a need for answers and control. In today's episode, I'm chatting with Drew Jackson, the founding pastor of Hope East Village in New York City. Drew lives in Lower Manhattan with his wife and twin daughters. He's written 2 collections of poems, God Speaks Through Wombs and Touch the Earth, in which he reflects on the Gospel of Luke. His poetry is part protest, part biblical commentary, and provides a fresh perspective as he weaves the biblical narrative with contemporary issues of justice, lament, and hope. I've heard Drew recite his poems on several occasions and finally had a chance to talk to him in more depth at a conference we were at last year. He gifted me a copy of Touch the Earth, and I can tell you I will never be the same. Reading his poems touched my heart and soul, and so for Advent this year, I purchased a copy of God Speaks Through Wombs, and that is just as powerful. Drew is a true liturgical rebel who reinterprets the story of God appropriately for today's world. So welcome, Drew, to the Liturgical Rebels podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Christine.
Oh, you're welcome. I've really been looking forward to this. So why don't we start? Why don't you tell me a little about yourself, your background and really how you got into poetry like this beautiful poetry that you write.
Yeah, I would love to. I realized I should have sent you an updated bio because we moved to Brooklyn, so we live in Brooklyn now, and I actually recently transitioned out of pastoring the church that I did plant 6 years ago, and I'm now working full time with the Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful! So you work long distance?
I do, yeah, remotely.
Good.
Yeah, but I grew up in southern New Jersey, just across the bridge from Philadelphia, the youngest of 4 boys. And, really, I say that my love of poetry began with a love for hip hop music. Being the youngest of 4, my oldest brothers, they were always listening to music, always listening to hip hop. And so I have very vivid memories of, riding in their cars as they're older and just listening to music and hearing the words and the beats and really being drawn to the way that these words, these lyrics could fit together, the rhyme schemes and the stories that they were telling. And it just drew me in. And my mom was also an artist of her own, a visual artist, but also a writer and a poet. And so I just found myself around it a lot, around art a lot. And I started writing lyrics first, spending a lot of time during my college years. I would do a lot of writing. And I kind of put it to the side when I stepped into my ministry work. So went into seminary, started doing some campus ministry work, and I found that all of my writing ended up being sermon writing.
Oh,
And
yes.
yeah, and it really didn't pick back up for me in terms of poetry until the pandemic began.
Mm.
And um, I like to say that poetry found me again during that time. But I started reading just a ton of poetry, ton of different poets, and picked up writing poetry in the form I'm writing now as a spiritual practice.
Mm.
Recognizing that I needed, I didn't know it then, but I know now that I needed a practice that was spacious enough to hold all of the questions that were swirling in me at the time. Questions of, you know, obviously the things that were happening in the world in terms of the pandemic, but also things that were happening in terms of the you know, the racial tension, racial violence, violence, police brutality, things like that were just on the rise at the time, and I needed to talk through them, and
Mm-hmm.
poetry became a way for me to do that. So, and I've realized that poetry is something for me that is not a side thing, but is very central to my heart and vocation.
Mm.
So that's been a little bit of my journey with poetry.
Fascinating. It's interesting to me, what you said there, because I think a growing number of people, I'm finding a growing number of my friends are writing poetry. And I would say, even though they wouldn't articulate it as well as you did, that, it's got some of the same kind of roots. It's a way of expressing ourselves that has so much more power, I think, than just writing does. I've certainly been finding that, and I know it's true with people I know all over the world. In fact, I noticed another one of my friends down in South Africa yesterday wrote his first poem. I thought,
amazing,
you're getting there.
Amazing.
And it was
I love that.
Yeah, isn't that wonderful?
Well, I came across an article about 2 years back that the title of it was "Are we entering a new golden age of poetry?" And and basically the article was really talking about how there's this reemergence of poetry readership these days, and just speculating about why that might be. And I really do think it has something to do with the fact that we are facing such cosmic questions that don't have easy answers, and poetry is one of the places where you don't go to poetry to get answers. You go to poetry to sit longer in the questions, and to be invited into mystery. So, so I think that there's something to that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, definitely. And I think, it's easy for us to forget that, some of the Bible, of course, was written as poetry and not just
Absolutely.
the Psalms,
Yep.
And I think that there's that same sense. And I think it's wonderful to see people rediscovering this in this way. But why the Book of Luke? Your two books of poems, reflect on the Book of Luke. And I love the Book of Luke, but I was wondering, why?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of things that were coming together for me there. The first thing was, I love Luke, and I'm drawn to, like, remember I mentioned that I started writing during a time at the beginning of the pandemic where there's just all these questions swirling, and particularly with questions around systemic racism in the United States. I felt like in my poetry, I wanted to have conversation with not only myself, but with some people who knew what it meant, what it felt like to live and experience oppression. And I could talk with them honestly. because I felt like one of the things that was happening in conversations around race was that, a lot of times your experience of racism gets questioned. Like, did that really happen? Is that real?
Yes.
And so I wanted to have some conversations in my poetry, and with some people who are like, that sort of reality wouldn't exist. And so I found myself drawn to Luke because Luke is interested in his gospel and centering the voices and experiences of those on the margins.
Mm-hmm.
And so particularly the voices of women, the voices of the poor, those are centered in Luke's telling of this narrative. And just the simple fact that the biblical text as it stands is not written from the perspective of Rome, right? It's written from the perspective of those on the underside of the empire. And so it's like, well, let me sit and bring my full self as a Black man navigating this landscape of America into conversation with the people in the Gospel of Luke in that text and see where the conversation goes. The other part of that, though, is that at the time I was at our church. We were preaching through some of the Psalms, and we were particularly sitting in Book 2 of the Psalter. Right. And so picking up, there's a rabbinic tradition that talks about how the 5 books of the Psalter are in conversation with the 5 books of Torah, and that they're not meant to be commentaries on them, but they are conversing with the different themes and elements of those books. And so sitting in Book 2, I was really interested in how those Psalms, those poems were in conversation with the Exodus. And when you start to read those Psalms with the backdrop of Exodus, they start to sound a little differently and they feel different. So when you hear a Psalm, talking about, my soul thirsts for you, oh God, those sort of Psalms, and, my flesh cries out for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. You think about now the people of Israel in the wilderness, in the desert, longing for freedom, searching for a promised land. All these sorts of elements come through. And I started to ask the question, what would it feel like and sound like if the Gospels gave rise to poetry in our day? What would that feel like? And so I started just to write and experiment and see where that took me. And so I think those two things really coming together led me to Luke. And I wasn't sure where it would go, and it turned out to be this.
Oh, it's wonderful. It really is. And not surprisingly, as a woman, one of the things that really impacted me is your sensitivity to the women in the story. Not just as passive receptacles of something that the men are doing, but really as the main characters in the whole story. And I just love that, the way you talk about Elizabeth. I've never heard anybody speak more powerfully about Elizabeth than you do in that poem, God Speaks Through Wombs. And it just, it had quite an impact on me. I've just read it and read it and read it. And then, Mary's song too, I didn't write down the name here, but where you say, that girl can sing. And I just had this wonderful kind of vision of Mary singing, and not singing kind of opera, kind of for somebody's entertainment, but singing out justice and singing out rebellion and singing out truth, in a way that we've kind of wiped out of the gospel story sometimes, I think. And I just, you can tell, powerful words, powerful images that they evoked for me as well. And I just love this. And so I was wondering, will you read God Speaks Through Wombs for us?
Absolutely. I would love to. God speaks through wombs. In the days of empires and puppet regimes, God speaks. through wombs, wrested and discarded because they were unviable. This is what they do. The Romes, the Babylons, the USAs, the men. Tossed to the side as detritus, what they've deemed unfit to be utilized. But God speaks through wombs, birthing prophetic utterances. The object of public scorn, given the power to name the happenings of the Lord. Elizabeth is her name. Say her name. It is she who will be the one through whom covenant is kept. She, like a priestess, speaks her word, while the leading male voices are shut. Enough of this unbelieving religion that masquerades as faith. Divine favor is placed on what we have disgraced.
So powerful. And as I said, that sensitivity to women. And so I was wondering, where does that sensitivity come from, Drew? Because I don't find it in that many men.
Well, I think first and foremost, it comes from my mom. You know, I dedicated this book to her, and you know, she passed away 10, almost 11 years ago at this point, from cancer, and she was someone who really embodied that prophetic witness in the world, in our small corner of the world where we were. I watched her, I saw her. She was both a mystic, and someone who, you know, in the space that we were in, articulated and really embodied that stance of justice. So I grew up in a independent, very fundamentalist Baptist conservative church space where, you know, women were certainly not allowed to speak, you know, to speak up front, to preach. And I saw my mom, who, I mean, she just walked in this deep, deep communion and union with God, experientially, in a way that you couldn't really deny it. And so, there were often times where the church and the men in the church would see it, and they would want the gifts that she had to bring, but they wanted to control and box it in. And I saw her really just challenge those things. And she invited, I mean, I grew up, like I said earlier, I grew up with 3 older brothers. And so it was my mom and a house full of guys. And she was very, very intentional about articulating to us and teaching us, you know, that she had a voice, and that it wasn't just a man's world, right? So I think it really started with her, and but then being able to see that to see the way that Jesus centered women, and the ways that he was so pushing against the cultural norms of his time, and saying, okay, if this is what Jesus was doing, if this is what Jesus was like, then certainly, being a disciple of Jesus, who is a man, right? It would follow then that I'm invited to follow Jesus in this way, and to think about what it means and what it looks like to use the power that I have and the voice that I have to elevate women. Like, what does that mean for me? And so, and I think lastly, I think things come full circle, right? Or it's like my mom was the only woman in our household, now I'm the only man in this. Like I have my wife and daughters, and it's just me. So it's I don't know. So it's on my mind, and it like what does it mean for me to live justly in this way as a man? And so yeah, I think all of those different things coming together for me.
Oh, that's lovely. When you say that, it reminds me of an experience that I had when I was working as a physician in the refugee camps on the Thai-Cambodian border way back in the 80s. And I will never forget one of the Cambodian medics that worked with us, and she had 2 daughters. And she came up to me one day, and, we'd been chatting, and she said to me, she said, my hope for the future is that my daughters will have the same kind of freedom that you've got in your life. And I've never forgotten that. I've wondered what happened to those little girls that they were at that time, and how many women in this world need to find that kind of freedom that you express in your poetry, in such a beautiful way. And so thank you for that lovely tribute to your mother too. That's just very, very powerful. And of course, the other theme that you talk about a lot is justice.
Yes.
And to be honest, I wonder how you can talk about that as a Black man who I'm so sure has suffered a lot of injustice without speaking with an angry edge. And yet your poetry doesn't speak with an angry edge. It speaks with a beautiful, soft voice that, wow, has a punch to it, but not an angry punch. It's a powerful punch that is something that we white people need to hear. And as I read through some of your poetry, and I think of some of the things that you must have gone through, I wonder how you keep that. Again, my favorite poem in this is, The Faces of the Blessed. And, when you say, I guess blessing means entitlement, it really was like an arrow kind of piercing my heart and thinking, wow, I am so entitled in so many ways, and so that had a huge impact on me as well. But the gentleness with which you say it was very compelling too. So how do you maintain that? I'm sorry, I know this is a pretty hard question to be asking you, but, I'm sure that I and the listeners will be interested in that too.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I don't know that I always do maintain it. It's one of those things that I'm constantly holding and examining. And I would say too that I think I would say that there is an anger. Like I've always been a person who has struggled to access my own anger. And it's been a journey for me to even step into that and know that anger is a valid emotion. And so I think part of what poetry has allowed me to do has been able to tap into that, but do it in a way that's I don't know, poetry. I think of that quote where Emily Dickinson says, when she's talking about poetry, she says that in the poem, you tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Right. And there's a way that poems sort of come through the side door and they say a thing, but it's not a head-on collision. Oftentimes it kind of sneaks up on you and you don't even realize what's happening until you're in it. And I found that for me, it's been a way for me to access my anger, but in a way that feels native to me. Right. I don't do well with the sort of confrontational, like, that's not how I'm wired. But I do have like I do have things that need to be expressed, and so
Yes.
so poetry has allowed me to do that. I think the other thing has just been, trying to hold practices of silence and stillness, and
Mm.
bring that into the presence of God, and sit with it in a way that's like, okay, this is real. These feelings are valid. How do I carry them?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean for me to carry them? And so that the practice of silence and stillness has been crucial for me, in processing all of those feelings, and knowing that in anger is neutral. It's neutral, and it's like you can either take it one way or the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what does it look like to hold that in a righteous way? And for me, it's how do you hold it in a way that does not turn around and dehumanize,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and do the same thing that was done to you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's just kind of constantly being in conversation with myself, in that regard, um, has been part of the journey for me.
Mm. Well, I think you're right. I think that contemplative practices and silence and things like that can really help us to deal with the anger, because, I just wish there were a few more people around these days that could be trained in this kind of an approach, because we live in such an angry world.
We
And,
do.
people unfortunately have not learnt the power of silence, the power of quietness and things like that to help them to process that anger. And so I'm very glad
Yeah.
you've discovered that.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is I've always is been recognizing that anger, is often what's called a surface emotion. Right. And so it's usually connected to a deeper grief or sadness underneath of it when you sit with it long enough. And so I've begun to engage with anger as an invitation, and to ask the question, what's beneath it? Where's the grief at? Where's the sadness? What's it connected to? And I think that has led me to, or has allowed like some softness to seep into the space of anger, just following the trail of it to what it's really connected to for me.
Wonderful. And I presume that the work you're doing now with the Centre for Contemplation and Action probably is helping build on that too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about, your new job then? What are you doing at the centre there?
Yes. So for those who may not be familiar with the center, the CAC, it was started in 1987 by Father Richard Rohr, and he started it as, in his words, as a school for prophets, right? As really learning how to walk the path of holding together those two things, contemplation and action. And he always says that the most important word in our title is "and," right? It's to live in that space of tension. It's to hold seeming contradictions or opposites together. And so my role there is I'm the director of mission integration, and which basically means that a large part of my responsibility is helping us as an organization to stay mission aligned and values aligned in our work as we move forward into the future. So we have a team of about 50 staff, and I work with our staff across all of our departments to, help us think through our mission and values and culture, how we're operating as a staff. Are we staying tethered to the Christian contemplative tradition? How is that influencing our actual work that we do as staff? It's been an important time for us as an organization where we're at founder transition, as Father Richard has gotten older and has transitioned out of his active role within the organization, we're tasked with the question of what does it look like to move into a future beyond Father Richard. And so,
Yes.
so my role is really just to help us continue to consider how we hold that vision and that mission that has been so dynamic and central into the future beyond Father Richard's presence.
Wonderful. It really resonates with me. I have called myself a contemplative activist for many years before I heard that term being used by the centre there. And partly because I have worked a lot in the third world, and I found that the contemplative practices were what gave me the strength that I needed to be able to continue doing the kinds of things that I was doing. And I feel that we need that balance between contemplation and action. I must say, I get a little frustrated with people that are contemplatives with no action, and I get a little frustrated with people who are activists with no contemplation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I 100% am with you on that. Yeah.
Good. Well, getting back to your poetry, do you have a favorite poem that you would like to read for us?
That's such a hard question. I don't know that I don't know that I have a favorite poem. I love them all for different reasons. But I guess I can share.
Yeah, is there one that you would like to share?
Yeah, I'll share. What I'll do is I'll share the title poem for Touch the Earth.
Okay.
And this poem is the first poem in the book. And so this collection of poems picks up in Luke chapter 9. And this is when there's a real turn in Luke's narrative where the story becomes much more focused on the journey of the disciples, and Jesus, it's the first time he sends them out. And so this is just a reflection on Jesus getting ready to send out the disciples to put into practice the things that they have been learning. And I'll say this before too, is that this book, the first one I dedicated to my mom, the second one I dedicated to my dad. And I say, he is the person who taught me that faith is more than talk.
Wonderful.
Touch the Earth. My father says more with his hands than he does with his lips. I cannot recall him sitting me down to teach me about love, but I watched him tend to my mother as cancer spread through her insides. He cried when her breath left her, though he never lectured me about grief. I am still grieving my mother, still gleaning what my father taught me. Gather it from memory. Let it touch the earth.
Oh, that's so powerful and beautiful. Yeah, I don't think we ever stop grieving our mothers and missing our mothers, do we? Yeah,
never.
That's beautiful, Drew. That really is lovely.
Thank you.
Are you writing another book of poems?
I am. I'm writing. I don't have this book. I'm still working on things. There's nothing under contract yet, but we'll see where it goes. This one is in. I was really, really interested in. There's so many people who have been talking about how we right now are living in apocalyptic times, right? That word has been used, and that word apocalyptic or apocalypse in the truest sense of the word has to do with an uncovering and an unveiling, a revealing of what's underneath, right? So it's less to do with like the end of days and more to do with like, hey, let's pull back the curtain and see what's really going on. And so I was drawn to the poetry of Revelation, right?
Wow, that's
The
quite an
apocalypse.
undertaking.
Yeah, and to see, you know, how John the Seer uses poetry to talk about, make sense of, have conversation with an apocalyptic time of his own, that he was living in the church was living in the context of empire. And so this volume is talking with Revelation, particularly with the introductory section. So that would be chapter 1, and then the letters to the 7 churches. So we'll see where it goes. I'm really interested to see how these poems, as I'm writing them, are revelatory, just in terms of, okay, me asking questions about some of the cosmic realities that we're dealing with. Okay, what's being uncovered right now for us? What are we being invited to see? You know, at a national level, as the church right now, what's being uncovered? But then even personally, like, what is being revealed in me right now that I'm being invited to pay attention to? So it's like all these different layers of peeling back for me.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That is fascinating. I certainly look forward to when that comes together. That's quite a commitment. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's been fun to write.
Yeah, I can imagine. Drew, before we finish, is there something else that you would like to share with us here?
Oh, I mean, I think just, you know, I would say that just thinking about poetry, we've been having this conversation around, you know, the invitation of poetry right now for us, and you hinted at something earlier when you talked about the poetry, like biblical poetry, and how much that there is beyond the Psalms. There's so much poetry in the scriptures. So I just even talked about Revelation, but the prophetic texts are filled with poetry. They're mainly poetry, honestly, and so many of the prophets are poets. And then even, we don't often talk about Jesus as a poet, but, you know, the way that Jesus uses poetic devices in his parables is undeniable.
Yes.
What he is doing there. And so I think that it really just invites me to consider, what does poetry then have to do with our own journey and formation as people? What is it for in that sense? And I've just been really intrigued by that question in terms of how poetry connects to our own transformation and formation. And it really comes back for me to the need to let go of a need for answers.
Yes.
And that is such a important part, particularly of the spiritual journey, of learning to let go in that sense, because it's learning to let go of a need for control, and you know, which is really, really hard for us to do. And I think particularly for us in religious spaces, the church has, especially in the West, has been shaped according to, you know, give people answers.
Yes.
Like, give people the answers that they need. And so I really am, I think that what we need right now as the church is much more an invitation into the mystery of it all.
Yes. Oh, definitely.
And I think poetry is a doorway to that.
Yes.
So yeah, it's like if you're listening, my plea is sit with some poetry and see where it takes you and see how it leads you into the mystery. And I know that poetry can often be intimidating for people. I think particularly because of many times of like how it's been taught to us in school. And you don't necessarily have to come to a poem and say, what does this mean? Mm-hmm. You can let it linger for a while and see what rises in you. And I tell people, just read a lot of different poets, see what resonates, like in the same way that you listen to music, and you listen to different artists. Not every song, not every artist is going to resonate with your heart, and that's okay. But you don't stop listening to music because you didn't like one song. Yes. You keep listening and you keep listening. And I would say the same thing about poetry. Just keep reading, and you'll find the poems and the poets that sing to you.
I think that's very good advice. Very good advice. My entry into poetry that really resonated with me was through Celtic Christianity. And, the beautiful, sometimes just ditties, but poems and prayers and things that the Celtic saints wrote back in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries. And, and it started to open a doorway to poetry that I've just found such richness in too. And I would heartily agree with what you say, that going in the direction of poetry is a wonderful way for people to go, because it does help you to get into the mystery of the story, and away from seeing it as a kind of a scientific exploration to,
absolutely,
when we get into the Bible. And it's liberating. I think it draws us much closer to God, and it also draws us closer to, God's people and to the world that God has created as well. It's a wonderful approach. So Drew, absolutely, as we close here, how can people connect to you and buy your books?
Yeah. Well, you can find me. So my website is drewejackson.com. And then you can connect with me on social media. I'm mainly on Instagram at djackson poetics. You can also find me on Facebook. I'm over there too, Twitter, or X as it's called now. So any of those places, djackson poetics, you can find me, and you can get the books wherever you get your books. You can find them. And I'm a big proponent of independent bookstores. If you have one near you, support your independent booksellers. And so if they don't have it in stock, they can get it for you, the books. Yep. So, yeah.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you. This has been quite educational for me, and I hope it has been for our listeners as well. I appreciate you taking this time to do this interview. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I have been in conversation with Drew Jackson about poetry as spiritual practice and how it can help us express the laments and joys of life while enabling us to sit longer in the questions life raises, not looking for answers, but sitting in the mystery of all things. For more information about Drew, be sure to check out the show notes or visit Drew at his website, drewjackson.com. In the next episode of the Liturgical Rebels, I will be chatting to Scott Erickson, wonderfully creative artist and storyteller. He's the author of several books on prayer, illustrating by his creative and provocative artwork. His latest book is Say Yes, Discover the Surprising Life Beyond the Death of a Dream. I'm Christine Zine, author of The Gift of Wonder and facilitator of the Godspace Light website. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the podcast, or follow me on Instagram or Facebook.